Okay. So, just initially, just take me through your creative process and like, yeah.
Yes, well, I've always worked or have recently worked with fabric, and I'm very interested in our associations with fabric, how we live close to it, how we have memories associated with it. So it's always been one of my ideas to think, if I've got a good idea, shall I put it into fabric, or shall I paint it, or shall I draw it? So I thought using fabric was going to be very important to me, really. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And just tell me what like the piece is about.
Well, it started. I mean, it's interesting you should ask me about fabric, because it did actually start as a poem.
Mhm.
I started writing down some of the things that we were seeing in the newspapers and on the television, and I thought it was on a piece of paper, and I'd written it, and I looked at it, and I thought, well, nobody's ever going to see that. My notes in my sketchbook, who's going to see that? So I need to do it in a way that people will notice. How can I do it in a way that people will actually see it? I didn't want to paint lettering. I thought that's going to look like a poster or something. So I thought the other thing was attach it to this idea of fabric and memory, and also then thinking about how women over the past have spent their time very quietly, almost subversively, putting down their ideas in fabric using embroidery. And then I thought about the suffragettes, and I thought about the colour scheme and the way they actually spent a lot of time making their banners and their clothes and the things that they took around with them when they were on demonstrations. So the ideas were all starting to brew in my head, that all these things were starting to come together. And I've looked at one or two of the pieces of work that girls used to make, samplers, where they were supposed to, women are supposed to sit quietly and do their sewing in the past. This was a way to keep their hands busy and keep them occupied. And I thought, well, we were going for a period of time when we did have to keep ourselves occupied. So that was a similarity. And I thought, could this be a design like some kind of sampler, maybe with images? And I looked at a lot of samplers. I looked at one or two women historians, art historians, who've looked at samplers. And I looked at those and I thought, well, I don't want to actually do images. It's got to be the words. And over the period of time during lockdown, we had so much going on in the news, so many words, so many phrases. We were getting these phrases like the daily briefing was coming out, and save the NHS, and the word unprecedented, and over again. And Boris Johnson was saying, sing happy birthday. So, sing happy birthday while you're washing your hands, and all this sort of thing. So I thought, it's words, it's definitely words. And so I was scanning the newspapers each day, looking at the news, anything that caught my eye. And I actually got other people finding things, and they sent me things. What about so-and-so? What about so-and-so? If you put this in, if you put that in. And then I thought, well, every so often it's got to register the devastation that this is having on people's lives. So that's why every so often there's a red element, which actually says something like sadly died, which is what I think one or two of the government ministers were saying, things like that, sadly died. And I thought, well, how do you sadly die? You just die, don't you? And it's horrific. And it just built up. I started thinking, how do I do this? And I got some pieces of fabric and started sewing in different stitches and seeing which worked. And in the end, I thought the best thing is cross stitch. It's the easiest way to keep it regular. It will look a bit strange because it's hand sewn. It won't look machine finished or anything. And I tested out different sizes of lettering that would work, and how I would make it straight. That's an issue. You've got to think, how are you going to make it work? How's it going to be straight? And it ended up being really big. I mean, I think I started with the first piece of fabric, and I thought that would probably be it. That's what I'd do. So I put a ruled line down, ruled it out in pencil, drew the words out in pencil actually to start off with, and then just sat and sewed. And it would be every day, 2 or 3 hours a day, and listen to music. And I think at one period it was the proms, so I was listening to the proms, and then I'd listen back to things. So it was a way, it was a contemplation of getting through that period of time, which was very hard for everybody. And of course it just built up, so many things built up, and the scandals were starting to happen towards the end. We were becoming aware of some of the things that have been going on, and we were very aware of problems with the government and what was happening, and getting more and more concerned about what we were being told, phrases like lumpiness and bumpiness, was this kind of saying, was this appropriate when you have people dying of this terrible illness? It was a really tragic and difficult time for people, but it's also personal. I mean, there's personal reflections in here as well, because the first one is paracetamol, March 2020, and that's simply because I couldn't find any paracetamol when I was going shopping. There was no paracetamol anywhere, and I thought, my God, this is really serious. This is really serious. I've got to take this seriously. And then right down to the end, Partygate. And so the scandal and the troubles and the worry goes on for everybody. And so it's become just a massive piece of work, really, that I think everyone can relate to some of it, if not all of it, I think.
Okay, great. How important would you say it is to record history through art? What are your kind of opinions on that?
I think as an artist or as a worker with materials, it's very difficult not to record, because you're part of that period, aren't you? You're naturally part of the period. So in a sense, you can't avoid it. It's bound to be interlocked with what you're producing. But this was a very deliberate act of recording it. It was a protest, really. It was meant to be a protest, and it was meant to record the period we were going through. It's a very valuable thing to try and do, but on the other hand, you can think, well, is anybody going to be interested in it? Does it have a value to someone else? It certainly had value to me, because it was an outlet for me to go through. And I also thought, the back is also interesting, because it's the back of the sewing. And that, I thought, you've got the front where you've got all the lettering, looks fairly neat, and it's all as it should be. The cross stitches are all working as they should do. But on the back, you see the tension and the knots and the decisions, the threads that go slightly in the wrong direction. And that's more like we were feeling underneath. So there was that. You couldn't help it. I mean, it was a deliberate act to record history. And I think more of us need to do it, perhaps, in a deliberate way.
Kind of building on what you said, is there a particular reason why you chose to do it by hand instead of machine?
Well, there could be a practical reason. I think I'd find it hard to do something like this on a machine, although I know people who probably could. I think working with hand working is very important. I've always been a big proponent of that. It's good mentally and physically, and there's something about something that's been produced by hand that is different to something that's produced by a machine, even if that's operated by a person. It's just that, I just became more and more aware of this. This is becoming quite a thing, and it's because it's hand sewn. There are a number of projects I know that have happened since this, or even before this, where the artist involved has actually called upon a lot of people to produce something by hand, and then they've put it together. And I did do a project like that before, where I asked people to contribute their piece, and then I would collate it and curate it, as it were. But I just thought, this just has to be me. I didn't really want anyone else to work on it. But ideas since then I've had are that maybe someone else could contribute to it, and I could put it together in some way.
Yeah.
So it's very personal, really.
Yeah. And I know you talked about you started with a small bit of fabric.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, like, do you think, like, the scale of it, do you think it was, like, subconsciously intentional? And what do you think it says about what you want, like, your message?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I think I felt I wanted to see the words one after the other. It's a bit like a continuation, just going on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually thought of ideas where it would just literally go on and on and on, and they wouldn't be separate. They would be continuous. So I thought that was really ideas along those lines. And I thought, well, then in the end, it's like banners. They're like banners. So they're like big banners, and from a practical point of view, how they're going to be exhibited or if they're going to be seen, it's probably better that I try to be more practical. But it's the project. I would be quite honest and say it developed as it went along. I didn't have a massive plan at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It just started off and developed and became something. And in the end, I had quite a problem making sure I could get the same fabric, because it was bought from one specific shop, and I had to make a special order to get the same fabric, which seems weird because I could have had different fabric. And also the colours of the colours that I chose for the silks. Again, I started to have trouble getting those because it was during COVID itself, during the lockdown. And so I had to go through some effort to make sure I had enough of the materials to make it, because the green and the purple are the suffragette colours,
Mm-hmm.
and the red was just me putting that in.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, from a material point of view, I was working sort of as I went along, trying to cope with it. So.
Right. And like, I know you kind of already touched on this, but like, did you have any challenges, and how did you like overcome them, especially in such like a difficult time?
I think it must have been. It's very interesting to look back at that period, and I think probably this piece of work helps other people to think back. What were they doing?
Mm.
What was I doing when I was doing this? I was just in a sort of, in a kind of, I don't know, cocoon, producing this thing. So it was important for me to do that. I think you always have this little voice in your head that says, what on earth are you doing? Why on earth are you doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the point? And there's always that little voice that's saying that. But there must have been a very much stronger voice which was saying, you have to do it, and you're going to get on and do it. So that was the only struggles, were the practical material side of things, and just this little voice saying, what on earth are you doing? And why? Why are you doing it?
And then just like, do you think you have learned anything from doing such like a big project?
Yeah, I like doing big projects, and I think the one thing I think is this did become very important to me personally, but I would like to go on and do something where I'm engaging other people in things. I did a project once where I asked people to take one particular hour of one particular day and send me whatever it is they were doing at that point. So it could be a photograph of what they were doing, or a drawing, or just a memory, a written thing, a diary, anything. And I would then I made a film about that. And I like the idea of maybe getting other people's contribution and piecing it together. That was about time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that hour, what was happening in that hour to people. And I would like to develop an idea along these lines, but maybe pull other people into it and try and make a collaborative piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
We were forced to be alone, weren't we? We were forced to not make contact. In between, there were times when we could get together under certain circumstances, restricted. It was all very tricky, and wearing masks and everything. So we were encouraged to be alone. So that kind of fitted in. But now I think it would be nice to do something with more people.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And finally, just like retrospectively, what are your thoughts on your piece now? And like, is there something you feel like at this certain point of time you would have done like differently?
Well, from a practical point of view, I think I've mentioned that I would be thinking about the fabric, and I think it shows that it was a struggle.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that whoever produced it was going through a struggle of some kind. And so it kind of had its own life. I know they say this, that sometimes you're doing a piece of work and it just has its own existence, and you're literally the I don't know, the corridor, you're just there to produce it. You're not necessarily completely in control of it. I think that's one of the wonderful things about art, is that you think you're planning, you think you know what you're doing, but something else can happen when you're working, if something special. You know, a lot of the time you think you've got a plan. When I taught art, it was all about planning and knowing what you were going to do and looking at other artists. But there is always that element of surprise and experimentation. And I think that's when things start coming together and it has its own life. And you're just the I don't know, there's a word, isn't there, for that? The conduit. You're the conduit for that work to be produced. And you can then fold it up and put it away in a bag and forget about it for 6 months. Or you can try and get it out to be seen. And the important thing is with something like this is that people see it, and it maybe makes them think, what could they do, or how did they feel, or what were they doing?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, okay, that's great. Okay.